Imagine holding a clay tablet in your hands. It's small, barely the size of your palm, and it's been buried beneath the Iraqi desert for over 5,000 years. Your fingers trace the wedge-shaped marks pressed into its surface. They're precise, deliberate. Someone pressed these marks into wet clay with a reed stylus, let it dry in the Mesopotamian sun, and then it disappeared for 5 millennia. The dust of southern Iraq clings to your skin. The air is dry, warm, ancient. It carries the faint mineral scent of sun-baked earth, a smell that hasn't changed in 50 centuries. And these marks, these tiny, careful impressions, describe beings who existed before human civilization began. Now, we call these stories mythology. We file them alongside Greek gods and Norse legends, fascinating, but fictional. But here's the thing, these aren't stories, they're times records, cuneiform administrative records. The oldest form of writing ever discovered, pressed into clay tablets at Eridu and Uruk cities that shouldn't have existed when they did. Cities with irrigation systems, astronomical calendars, and mathematical precision that appeared, as far as archaeology can tell, fully formed. No trial period, no gradual development. Just there. That's like finding a library in a village that hasn't invented writing, 3200 BC. That's when these tablets were pressed. And the records they contain describe a structured hierarchy of beings who governed humanity's earliest cities, beings the Sumerians never called gods. They called them the Times Anunnaki, and the evidence for their existence keeps getting times stronger, not weaker. The tablet in your hands is just the beginning. But before we follow where it leads, let me ask you something. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I made this. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now. Someone in Tokyo at sunrise, wondering about ancient tablets over morning coffee. Someone in London at lunch, earbuds in, escaping the noise for a few minutes. Someone in New Mexico at 3 a.m., lying in the dark with the same question humanity's been asking for 5,000 years. Wherever you are, you're not listening alone tonight. I always check the comments, and every time I'm amazed by how many of us end up in the same place. At the same hour, scattered across the world, but listening to the same story. There's something quietly beautiful about that. So here's what we're doing tonight. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to follow a thread. It starts in the marshlands of southern Iraq, in the oldest city ever built by human hands, and it stretches all the way to the Egyptian pyramids. The Book of Enoch, a frozen mountain peak in Lebanon, and a question that still has no definitive answer. We'll hold tablets. We'll descend into underground chambers. We'll stand inside a 5,000-year-old building and listen to the stones hum. And the remarkable times thing about this thread, it doesn't end. Every new discovery makes it stronger. So settle in, get comfortable, pull the blanket up if you need to. There's no rush tonight. There's no test at the end. Tonight, we're going way back, past the pyramids, past the pharaohs, past everything you learned in school, back to the very first records of civilization itself. And it starts with 7 names. 7 names pressed into clay at the dawn of writing the Apkallu. The Sumerian king list is one of the oldest documents in human history. It's a clay prism, the Weld-Blundell prism, to be specific, and it sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. You could walk right past it. It looks like a small clay pillar, about 8 inches tall, covered in tiny cuneiform writing. But what it says is times extraordinary. It lists every king who ever ruled in Sumer, going back to what the Sumerians called the beginning. And before the human kings, before the first dynasty, before the first city-state, it lists 7 figures. Not kings, not warriors, teachers. The Apkallu. That's what the Sumerians called their 7 original sages. And the word itself tells you something important. Apkallu translates roughly as wise one of the deep, not God, not spirit, wise one. Now, here's the thing about these 7 sages. Each one was assigned to a specific antediluvian ruler, a king who reigned before the Great Flood, and each one brought a specific domain of knowledge, not vague wisdom, not general guidance. Specific, technical knowledge. The first was Adapa, sometimes written as Yuana, and the Sumerian texts say he completed the plans of heaven and earth. That's a remarkable phrase. Not studied the plans, not received the plans, completed times them, as if the knowledge was already in progress, and Adappa's role was to finish the implementation. A Babylonian priest named Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BC, nearly 2,000 years after these tablets were first pressed, he described this same figure under a different name, Oannes. And Berossus's account is fascinating. He was writing for a Greek audience, translating Sumerian records into language that Aristotle's students could understand. According to Berossus, Oannes emerged from the Persian Gulf. He appeared among the earliest human settlements in southern Mesopotamia, and he taught them mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, temple construction, the foundations of urban civilization. Then he left, and the remaining 6 Apkallu arrived over subsequent generations, each one specializing in a different knowledge domain. One taught priesthood and temple rituals, another taught writing and record-keeping. A third taught metallurgy, the science of turning raw ore into copper, then bronze, then tools that could build cities. A fourth taught urban planning, how to lay out streets, irrigation channels, granaries, defensive walls. Think about that for a moment. This isn't mythology in the way we usually understand the word. There are no epic battles here, no love triangles among the gods, no moral fables. This is an organizational chart, a knowledge transfer system. 7 specialists, each with a defined domain, deployed sequentially to a pre-agricultural civilization. It reads less like a creation myth and more like a development program. Here's what nobody tells you about the Apkallu tradition. It doesn't just appear in one text. It appears across multiple independent sources spanning over 2,000 years. The Weld Blundell Prism, the Bit Mazeri incantation series that translates as the House of Protective Spirits, the Uruk List of Sages, the Babylonian creation texts, and Berossus, writing from the Library of Babylon itself. The consistency is remarkable. 7 sages, specific knowledge domains, pre-flood deployment, post-flood, modified supervision. The details vary slightly from source to source. You'd expect that over 2 millennia of copying, but the structural framework stays identical. 7 sages, a deliberate system. But who sent them? And how did 7 individuals, however wise, however skilled, transform scattered settlements of reed huts and fishing boats into a civilization that invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, and urban architecture? The tablets don't answer that question directly, but they point somewhere, and to follow where they point, we need to do something that most people skip. We need to look at the language itself. Because the words the Sumerians use, the actual cuneiform signs, contain a trail that stretches far beyond Mesopotamia. In Sumerian, the word for a divine being is Dingir. It's one of the oldest signs in cuneiform, a star shape, 8 points, pressed into clay. And what it means, at its root, isn't God in the way we understand that word. It's closer to bright one or shining one, a being associated with light. Now follow this trail. When the Akkadians, the Semitic-speaking people who lived alongside the Sumerians, adopted cuneiform writing, they translated Dingir into their own language. And one of the words they used was Igigi, the Igigi. That's what the Akkadian texts call the worker class of divine beings, the ones who labored before humans were created. 200 of them, stationed at Nippur. Remember that number, 200. We'll come back to it. The linguistic trail doesn't stop there. From Akkadian, the concept travelled into Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke, the language of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in Aramaic, the word becomes ear, watcher, the same word that appears in the Book of Daniel, chapter 4, verse 13, one of the oldest books in the Hebrew Bible. Here's what nobody tells you about this linguistic trail. It's not a metaphor. It's not a cultural borrowing. It's a direct etymological chain Dingir to a gigi, to a spanning 3 languages, 3 civilizations, and over 2,000 years. The word changes. The concept doesn't. Someone was watching, but language is just one strand of evidence. Let's look at what's in the ground. Tel Es Sor 1, northern Iraq, 6000 BC. Archaeologists found precision irrigation channels, not rough ditches, but engineered waterways with calculated gradients and pottery decorated with astronomical patterns that correspond to observable stellar cycles. 6,000 years before Christ, 4,000 years before the pyramids. Jarmo, northeastern Iraq, 7,000 BC. Geometric architecture, with proportions that match, and this is the strange part, proportions that match later Greek and Egyptian sacred geometry. The golden ratio, appearing in a settlement of maybe 100 people who are supposedly just learning to farm. But here's where the evidence gets really interesting. The Plimpton 322 tablet. It's small, about the size of a postcard. It was found in the ruins of Larsa, in southern Iraq, and it dates to roughly 1800 BC, and it contains trigonometric calculations. Not basic arithmetic, not simple counting. Trigonometry, the mathematics of angles, triangles, and spatial relationships. The kind of mathematics that wasn't officially discovered until the Greek period, over 1,000 years later. That's like finding a smartphone blueprint in a medieval monastery. Now, conventional archaeology has a very reasonable explanation for each of these individual finds. Irrigation develops through trial and error. Geometric proportions can arise independently. Mathematical tablets might represent isolated genius. And honestly, each of those explanations works fine. In isolation, but here's the thing. When you stack them together, precision irrigation at 6,000 BC, sacred geometry at 7,000 BC, advanced trigonometry appearing fully formed, a pattern emerges, one that the individual explanations don't address. Archaeologists call it a discontinuity in human development, advanced knowledge appearing without developmental precursors, like finding the final chapter of a book with no preceding pages. And the Sumerian texts themselves have a very specific explanation for this discontinuity. 7 teachers, specific knowledge domains, deployed before the flood, somewhere beneath southern Iraq. The marshlands stretch to the horizon. Reed beds rustle in a warm wind that smells of salt and river mud. This landscape hasn't changed much in 7,000 years. And beneath this landscape, beneath layers of flood sediment and collapsed mud brick, and the dust of 50 centuries, there are chambers, underground chambers, reaching down to the water table. And that's where we need to go next. Down to a city called Eridu, the oldest city on Earth, and to the beings who, according to every cuneiform source that mentions them, built it. Eridu. The Sumerians themselves said it was the first city. Not a city among many times the first. And when Fuad Safar led an Iraqi archaeological expedition there in 1946, he found something that stopped him cold. 17 building levels. Layer upon layer of construction, reaching back to roughly 5,000 BC. And here's what made no sense. The earliest layers, the very bottom, the very first buildings ever constructed on this site, were the time's most sophisticated. Not the most primitive, the most sophisticated. The architecture was precise. The hydraulic engineering was advanced. The temple layout followed acoustic principles that modern engineers are still studying, and all of it appeared fully formed from the very first layer, as if someone arrived at this marshland and simply began building, with a plan already complete. Conventional archaeology suggests this represents a cultural transplant builders from an earlier undiscovered site, and that's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. But the Sumerian texts offer a different explanation. They say Eridu was built by Enki. Enki. The name translates as Lord of the Earth, though a more precise reading of the cuneiform might be Lord of the Productive Land. He's the third of 3 primary figures in the Anunnaki Hierarchy, and his domain was the subterranean realm underground water systems, the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, and the Abzu. The Abzu. In Sumerian cosmology, this was the cosmic freshwater ocean beneath the earth. Every spring, every well, every underground river connected to the Abzu, and Enki's temple at Eridu the Abzu, literally, the house of the deep water, was built directly above the water table. Now imagine this. Imagine descending a narrow stone staircase. The air changes as you go down cooler now, damp. You can feel the temperature shifting against your skin with each step. The walls are close, smooth limestone, cool to the touch, and you can hear something. Below you, a slow, rhythmic drip echoing off stone walls that haven't seen sunlight in 5,000 years. The darkness isn't frightening, it's calm, like the earth itself is breathing, slow, steady. The air tastes of mineral dust and deep time, and somewhere below your feet water moves, ancient water, the same water that was here when the first brick was laid on the surface above you. Above Enki, in the Anunnaki Hierarchy, were two other figures. Anu, the name means simply sky, or heaven. He governed from the northern reaches of Mesopotamia. His primary site was the Anu Ziggurat at Uruk, a massive stepped structure. Inside, there are chambers, internal chambers that German acoustic engineers tested in the 20th century, and they discovered something remarkable. The chambers resonate at specific frequencies that correspond to the human voice range, specifically the male baritone. Stand inside one of these chambers, speak, and the stone itself seems to amplify your words, as if the building was designed not just as a temple but as an acoustic instrument. Between Anu above and Enki below was Enlil, Lord of the Wind, or more precisely, Lord of the Command. Enlil governed from Nippur, in central Mesopotamia, and his role was the most complex of the three. If Anu was the chairman of the board, and Enki was the chief engineer, Enlil was the executive director. The one who implemented policy, the one who made decisions that affected the human population directly. And the Sumerian texts are remarkably specific about the tension between these three figures. Anu rarely intervened, Enki consistently advocated for humanity, and Enlil was pragmatic, sometimes protective, sometimes ruthless. The texts describe a system of checks and balances not unlike a modern government where decisions about humanity's future were debated, contested, and sometimes overruled. Here's what makes this extraordinary. This isn't how mythology works. Mythology gives you heroes and villains, clear moral lines, good gods versus bad gods. The Sumerian texts give you bureaucracy, a governance structure with competing interests, jurisdictional disputes, and policy disagreements. It reads less like a creation myth and more like meeting minutes. And somewhere in those meeting minutes, those clay tablets pressed 5,000 years ago, there's a document. A specific document that both Enlil and Enki fought over. A document that, according to the texts, contained the fundamental operating instructions for civilization itself. The Tablets of Destinies. And what those tablets contained and who controlled them would determine everything that happened next. To humanity, to the Anunnaki, to the 200 workers who were about to rebel. The Sumerians had a name for them, the Dup-Shemati, the Tablets of Destinies, and the descriptions they left behind are remarkably specific. These weren't symbolic objects. The cuneiform texts described them as physical artifacts that shone like the stars and spoke with voices of thunder when times activated. That last detail is worth pausing on. Activated. Not read, not consulted. Activated like a device with an operational state. The Tablets of Destinies appear across multiple Mesopotamian texts, spanning nearly 2,000 years. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation narrative, they're described as conferring absolute authority over heaven and earth. Whoever possessed them controlled the cosmic order, the seasons, the movements of celestial bodies, the boundaries between the realms of sky, earth, and underground water. Here's what makes this absolutely remarkable. When the tablets were stolen and the Sumerians recorded this as a historical event, not a parable, the entire system collapsed. The Epic of Anzu, that's one of the oldest narrative texts in human history, dating to roughly 2100 BC, describes what happened. A being called Anzu, sometimes translated as the Wise One who knows the heavens, managed to seize the Tablets of Destinies from Enlil's possession, and the moment they changed hands, the cuneiform texts say the cosmic order ceased to function, not figuratively. The texts are specific. The rites were suspended, the divine offices fell silent, radiance was extinguished. Now, you could read this as pure mythology, a story about divine objects with magical powers, and that's a perfectly reasonable interpretation. But there's a detail in the recovery narrative that makes it harder to dismiss. When the tablets were eventually retrieved through a military operation led by Ninurta, Enlil's warrior administrator, something unexpected happened. The texts describe a specific protocol for their reactivation. They didn't just hand them back. They performed what the cuneiform calls a namtar, a destiny determination ceremony, specific incantations, specific positioning, specific individuals authorized to handle the objects. It reads less like a mythological restoration and more like a system reboot. But here's where the physical evidence enters the picture. In 1933, a French archaeologist named André Parrot began excavating the ancient city of Mari, modern-day Tel Hariri, on the Euphrates River in eastern Syria. He would spend the next 22 years there, uncovering one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the ancient Near East. Among the ruins of the Temple of Ishtar and the Palace of Zimrilim, Parrot found elevated platforms, ceremonial installations with geometric inlays made of metal, and the surfaces of these platforms showed signs of intense localized heat exposure, not fire damage, not general burning, concentrated heat at specific points, consistent with something the archaeologists couldn't fully explain. The cuneiform tablets found at the same site describe these platforms as the locations where authority transfer ceremonies took place, where the Tablets of Destinies were presented to newly appointed rulers, where, according to the texts, the radiance of the tablets touched the one who was chosen. Think about what this means. We have cuneiform texts describing objects that shone and spoke and required activation protocols. And we have archaeological sites with unexplained heat signatures at exactly the locations where these objects were supposedly used. Neither the texts nor the archaeology prove anything on their own, but together they form a pattern that conventional categories struggle to contain. The distinction between supernatural and technological may simply be an artifact of our modern vocabulary, a limitation of our categories, not of their reality. The Sumerians didn't have a word for technology as we understand it, but they had a very precise word for what these tablets did. They called it Nam Destiny, the power to determine what happens next, and whoever controlled that power controlled everything. But the most controversial use of that power, the one that still divides scholars and fascinates anyone who reads these texts, is what happened next. The Atrahasis epic. It's one of the oldest narrative poems in human history. Clay tablets dating to roughly 1700 BC, though the story itself is almost certainly older, and it describes in remarkable technical detail the creation of human beings, not through divine will, not through cosmic accident, through a deliberate, engineered process designed to solve a very specific problem. The problem was labour. According to the Atrahasis, the lower-ranking Anunnaki the Igigi, the worker class we mentioned earlier, had been maintaining the infrastructure of Mesopotamia for generations, digging irrigation channels, building temple foundations, managing the agricultural systems that fed the entire operation, and after what the texts describe as 40 years of continuous labour, they revolted. Here's the thing about the Atrahasis account. The rebellion isn't described as chaos or rage, it's described as organised protest. The Igigi surrounded Enlil's temple at night. They burned their tools, and they demanded relief. The cuneiform literally says they threw down their baskets, the ancient equivalent of a labour strike. Enlil's response was fury. He wanted to punish them, but Enki, always the engineer, always the problem solver, proposed an alternative. Instead of punishing the workers, create replacements. And what follows in the Atrahasis text is extraordinary. Enki designed the process. A specialist called Nintu, sometimes identified as Ninhursag, Lady of the Sacred Mountain, carried it out. And the procedure is described with precision that feels deeply uncomfortable for a mythological text. 14 pieces of clay from the earth, mixed with the blood of a being called Kingu specifically, his Temu, a word that translates as planning capacity or rational intelligence. 7 pieces shaped male, 7 shaped female, each gestated for a specified period. The text says 10 months, which is remarkably close to human gestation. Now, conventional archaeology has a very different explanation for this. And honestly, that explanation works well. Creation myths appear in every ancient civilization, from the Popol Vuh of the Maya to the Dreamtime of Aboriginal Australians. Humans have always told stories about how they came to be. The Atrahasis is simply one of the oldest, and that's a perfectly reasonable position. But the cuneiform texts themselves describe something that doesn't quite fit the creation myth category. There are no cosmic eggs, no divine breath, no magical transformation. There's a procedure, specific materials, specific quantities, a specialist with a title, quality control. The texts mention that the first attempts weren't successful, that the mixture had to be adjusted. What if these tablets are describing technology we simply don't have the vocabulary to understand? Here's what makes the Atrahasis account genuinely unusual among creation narratives worldwide. It includes an economic motive. The beings weren't created out of loneliness, or love, or cosmic necessity. They were created because the existing workforce went on strike. That's not mythology. That's project management. And the text includes one more detail that haunts researchers who study it carefully. The enhanced capabilities given to the first humans, the intelligence, the reasoning capacity, the temu, mixed into the clay, diminished over successive generations. Each generation slightly less than the one before, as if the original template was degrading, diluting, like a copy of a copy of a copy. The Atrahasis ends with Enlil and Enki disagreeing about what they'd created. Enlil saw a potential threat, beings with intelligence borrowed from the divine, capable of independent thought, capable of questioning their makers. Enki saw an achievement, a solution that worked, a workforce that could maintain the infrastructure, beings with enough awareness to appreciate the world they'd been given. Two perspectives, two administrators, one creation, and their disagreement about humanity's value would eventually lead to the most consequential decision in Mesopotamian mythology, a decision that appears with extraordinary consistency in the records of time's every civilization on Earth. If the Sumerian accounts existed in isolation, if they were the only ancient civilization describing structured divine hierarchies, knowledge transfer systems, and beings who arrived before humanity, we could comfortably file them under mythology. Fascinating mythology. Beautifully detailed mythology, but mythology nonetheless. But then we look at Egypt. The Egyptian pyramid texts carved into the walls of the Pyramid of Unas around 2400 BC describe beings called the Neteru. The word translates, depending on context, as divine principles, watchers, or simply the Great Ones. And these Neteru are said to have descended from the sky during a period the Egyptians called Zep-Tepi I. Time. Here's where the evidence gets really interesting. The Neteru didn't arrive as a disorganized collection of gods. They arrived as a structured hierarchy, with territorial divisions, with specific domains of authority. And when you map those divisions against the Anunnaki hierarchy we've just walked through, the parallels are striking. Ra, the solar deity, governing from the south of Egypt. His domain was cosmic oversight, the sky, the movement of celestial bodies. Now compare that to Anu governing from the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, whose domain was also the sky and cosmic authority. Different name, different civilization, same function, same position in the hierarchy. Ptah, the master craftsman, the builder, governing from Memphis in northern Egypt. He was credited with creating the physical world through precise engineering. Compare that to Enki, the lord of the productive land, governing southern Mesopotamia, credited with hydraulic engineering and the construction of Eridu. Different name, same function, same relationship to physical creation. And then there's Thoth, the keeper of knowledge, the scribe, governing the central Nile region, the deity who maintained records, preserved mathematical knowledge, and served as intermediary between the higher and lower orders. Compare that to Nabu, the Mesopotamian scribe deity, keeper of the Tablets of Destinies, governing from Borsippa in central Mesopotamia. 3 primary figures, 3 territories, 3 functional domains, 2 civilizations separated by over 1,000 miles of desert. But the parallels go deeper than organizational charts. The cannibal hymn, inscribed in the Pyramid of Unas, one of the most controversial texts in all of Egyptology. It describes a process by which divine enhancement was transferred to pharaohs not through prayer, not through ritual alone, through what the text calls absorbing the powers of the Neteru, a specific physical procedure for transferring divine capabilities to human vessels. The structural parallel to the Atrahasis is impossible to ignore, a defined process for giving human beings enhanced qualities that originated with non-human beings. And then there are the underground chambers. Beneath the Giza Plateau, beneath the pyramids themselves, there are chambers measured with modern laser technology to a precision of fractions of a times millimeter, not centimeters. Millimeters. The engineering tolerances in these underground spaces match or exceed modern construction standards, and the astronomical alignments of these chambers correspond to stellar positions that also appear in Mesopotamian astronomical tablets. Here's the thing about these astronomical alignments. They're not approximate. They're precise to within arc minutes, fractions of a degree. The same star positions, the same mathematical relationships, in two civilizations that supposedly developed independently. If this were coincidence, it would be the most extraordinary coincidence in archaeological history. Two civilizations, separated by desert and language, and over a millennium of cultural development, independently producing the same hierarchical structure, the same knowledge transfer narratives, the same construction precision, the same astronomical mathematics. The conventional explanation is cultural diffusion ideas traveling along trade routes, and that's entirely possible. Mesopotamian and Egyptian traders did interact, particularly through the Levantine corridor, but cultural diffusion typically produces approximate copies, adapted versions, local variations. What we see here isn't adaptation, it's precision, the same three-tier hierarchy, the same functional domains, the same astronomical constants, as if both civilizations were working from the same original blueprint. And then there's a text that ties Mesopotamia and Egypt together with a thread so specific, so numerically precise, that it stops researchers in their tracks. The Book of Enoch. First Enoch, to give it its scholarly designation, is a collection of texts dating to roughly the 3rd century BC. Though many scholars believe the core material is significantly older, it was excluded from the biblical canon by most Christian traditions, but preserved in its entirety by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And in 1947, fragments of First Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, written in Aramaic, the language of Jesus, the language of the ancient Near East. Here's what makes this text absolutely remarkable. It describes times 200 times beings. The text calls them watchers, using the Aramaic word ear. They descended from the sky onto the summit of Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon, a real mountain, on the border of modern-day Syria and Lebanon. Elevation, 2,814 meters. The text names their leaders. Semjaza, the chief, who organized the descent. Azazel, who brought specific knowledge of metallurgy and weapon-making. The Dead Sea Scrolls fragments provide detailed taxonomies of the knowledge each watcher brought. Mathematics, astronomy, herbalism, enchantment, the reading of stellar signs. Now, if you've been listening carefully tonight, something should be clicking into place. 200 watchers descending from a mountain peak. 200 Igigi, the worker class in Mesopotamian texts stationed at Nippur. The same number. Two completely different traditions, written in different languages, preserved by different civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. 200 watchers. 200 Igigi. The same number. Now imagine this. Imagine standing at 2,814 meters. The air is thin and cold, so cold it burns your lungs with each breath. You can see your breath crystallizing in front of you, small clouds of warmth dissolving into the ancient cold. Below you, the landscape stretches in every direction. To the west, the Mediterranean catches the last light. To the east, the Syrian desert extends beyond the horizon, silent and vast. And around you, scattered across the summit plateau, megalithic ruins. Foundation stones weighing 20 tons or more, fitted together with the same impossible precision you've seen at Mesopotamian sites. No mortar, no binding agents. Just stone against stone, so tightly joined that you couldn't slide a piece of paper between them. And the silence. Not the silence of empty space, the silence of altitude, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your eardrums, that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The Book of Enoch goes further. It describes what the 200 watchers did after their descent. They took human wives, they taught forbidden knowledge, and their offspring, beings of unusual size and capability, became a problem that neither the watchers nor the higher authorities had anticipated. The text calls these offspring the Nephilim, and in Mesopotamian texts, a remarkably similar tradition appears. The Marriage of Martu text describes unions between divine and human beings, producing hybrid offspring with enhanced but unstable characteristics. But here's what nobody tells you about the Enochic tradition and the Mesopotamian records. It's not just the number that matches, it's the structure. Both traditions describe the same sequence of events. Authorized beings descend to Earth. They interact with humans beyond their mandate. They transfer forbidden knowledge. Their offspring create instability. Higher authorities intervene. The same narrative, the same sequence, the same consequences. And both traditions agree on what happened next. A resid. The punishment described in both traditions is severe but precise. The Watchers themselves, the 200 who descended without authorization, were bound, confined. The Book of Enoch says they were cast into darkness, into the valleys of the earth until the day of judgment. The Mesopotamian texts describe a similar confinement. The Igigi who overstepped their boundaries were removed from their positions and restricted. But the offspring, the Nephilim, the hybrid beings, posed a different problem entirely. They couldn't simply be confined. They were too numerous, too deeply integrated into the human population, and their existence represented something that both traditions describe with remarkable precision: the corruption of the original template. Not moral corruption in the modern sense, structural corruption. The carefully designed human template, the one Enki and Nintu had engineered, with such specific ratios and materials, had been altered without authorization, mixed with elements that weren't part of the original specification. Here's the thing about this flood narrative that changes everything. In the standard version most people know, the flood is divine punishment for human wickedness. An angry creator cleanses the earth. But that's not what the cuneiform texts say. The Sumerian version, the one that predates the biblical account by over 1,000 years, tells a different story. It presents the catastrophe as a calculated decision by the Anunnaki Council. Not anger. Calculation, not punishment, correction. What if the flood wasn't divine wrath? What if it was quality control? Think about it. The original human template was designed for specific purposes: to maintain infrastructure, to manage agricultural systems, to serve as the labor force that the Igigi could no longer provide. And that template had been compromised, altered by unauthorized genetic mixing. The Nephilim weren't just larger or stronger, they were unpredictable, unstable, operating outside the parameters of the original design. This wasn't divine wrath, it was quality control. But even within the Anunnaki Council, there was disagreement. Enlil advocated for total reset, eliminate everything, start over from nothing. Enki argued for preservation, save the best of what they'd created, protect the genetic line that still matched the original specification. And Enki won, partially. The texts describe what happened next with remarkable consistency across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian versions. A human was selected. The Sumerians called him Ziusudra, the Babylonians called him Utnapishtim, and the Hebrew tradition would eventually call him Noah. This individual received advance warning, specific instructions for constructing a vessel, precise specifications. The Gilgamesh account, Tablet 11, gives exact dimensions, deck layouts, and waterproofing materials, and critically instructions to preserve specific genetic material, the seed of all living things, the texts say. Not metaphor. Specification. The flood itself, whatever it was, is described across Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Hebrew, Hindu, Aztec, and Chinese traditions. 6 independent civilizations, 6 flood accounts, all with the same structural elements. Advance warning to a chosen individual, vessel construction, knowledge preservation, and coordinated rebuilding afterward. But here's what nobody tells you about this flood narrative. It's not the flood itself that's remarkable. Catastrophic flooding has occurred throughout geological history. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis, the Missoula floods, the post-glacial sea level rise. There are natural mechanisms. What's remarkable is what happened after. The texts describe a new arrangement, modified supervision, strict protocols. The direct interaction between the Anunnaki and humanity was restructured, less hands-on, more distant. Intermediary systems were established. Priesthoods, temple administration, systems of knowledge transmission that could operate without direct divine presence, as if the managers had learned a lesson, as if they'd decided that direct involvement created more problems than it solved. And the linguistic connections between traditions cement the pattern. The Aramaic Aya Watcher maps directly to the Akkadian Igigi. The Hebrew Nephilim, from the root nafal, meaning to fall, echoes the Sumerian descriptions of beings who came down from the cosmic order. The Greek Titans imprisoned beneath the earth after challenging the established order mirrors the confinement of the Watchers described in Enoch. Different languages, different civilizations, same story, same structure, same consequences. Somewhere tonight, on a shelf in the British Museum, there's a small clay tablet, Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh section. It describes this same flood, in the words of a man who says he survived it. The tablet is cracked, worn, nearly 4,000 years old, and the words pressed into its surface describe a world being remade, not destroyed, remade, as if someone pressed the reset button and then watched, more carefully this time. But the evidence doesn't end with the flood, because what happened in the centuries that followed in Egypt specifically suggests that the Watchers didn't just leave records. They left rulers, and now you're leaving Mesopotamia behind. Not permanently. You'll return. But right now, something is pulling you southwest across the open desert, past the dry sweep of the Sinai, toward the Nile. Because if everything you've encountered so far, the Sumerian king list, the Apkallu traditions, the antediluvian records carved into clay, if all of that existed in isolation, in one culture, in one corner of the ancient world, you could explain it away. You could call it mythology, a local tradition, an elaborate origin story, crafted by one civilization to make sense of its own beginnings. But that's not what happened, because thousands of miles from Sumer, in a completely separate civilization with a different language, a different writing system, a different religious framework entirely, the Egyptians recorded almost exactly the same thing, and they were very, very specific about it. Let's start with a single document. It's called the Turin Royal Canon, sometimes referred to as the Turin King List. If you've never heard of it, that's understandable. It's not the kind of artifact that generates headlines. It's a papyrus, fragmentary, badly damaged, housed today in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy. Written during the reign of Ramesses II, around 1200 BCE, which makes the physical document itself over 3,000 years old. But here's what makes it extraordinary. The Turin Canon doesn't just list the pharaohs of dynastic Egypt, the ones you'd find in any standard textbook. It reaches further back, much further. It records a sequence of divine rulers' beings the Egyptians called the Neteru, rulers who governed the Nile Valley for thousands upon thousands of years, before the first human pharaoh ever took the throne, and the numbers are times staggering. According to this document, the age of the divine rulers stretched back over 36,000 years, not hundreds, not a few cautious millennia. 36,000 years of governance by beings that the Egyptians explicitly classified as something other than human. Now, pause on that for a moment. Let that number settle. You're more than an hour into this journey. You've already seen the Sumerian king list with its impossibly long reigns stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. You've walked through the underground chambers at Eridu. You've stood on the slopes of Mount Hermon and read the inscriptions. And now here in Egypt, in a completely independent tradition, you're finding a record that describes the same fundamental structure. A period of non-human governance, followed by a transition to human rule. The parallels are becoming very difficult to dismiss. But the Turin Canon isn't the only Egyptian source telling this story. There was a man named Manetho, an Egyptian priest and historian who lived in the 3rd century BCE. during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek-speaking rulers controlled Egypt. Manetho composed a comprehensive history of his civilization called the Egyptiaca. The original text hasn't survived intact, but substantial portions were preserved by later writers Josephus, Eusebius, Africanus, who quoted him at length, and Manetho's account carries the same message. He described a layered sequence of dynasties that preceded human pharaohs entirely. First came the gods themselves, Ptah, Ra, Shu, Geb, Osiris, Set, Horus, each reigning for centuries or longer. Then came the demigods, beings of mixed origin, half divine, half something else. And only after these divine and semi-divine dynasties had run their course did human governance begin. The total duration Manetho assigned to these pre-human dynasties, over 24,000 years. Different numbers than the Turin canon, a different framework, a different century of composition, but the same fundamental claim that Egypt was governed by non-human intelligence for an extraordinarily long period before what we call recorded history. And then there's a third source, the Palermo stone, one of the oldest surviving royal annals from ancient Egypt, dating to approximately 2400 BCE. That's centuries before the Turin canon was written, centuries before Manetho was born. It's a fragment of a much larger slab, broken and incomplete, but the surviving portions reference rulers from before the first dynasty, divine kings, names that don't correspond to any known human lineage. 3 independent Egyptian sources, 3 different time periods, 3 different authors working in 3 different contexts, and all 3 converging on the same conclusion. Here's the thing, and this is what makes this part of the journey feel like a time's turning point. You're no longer examining one culture's internal mythology. You're seeing a pattern that crosses civilizations. The Sumerians recorded beings who came before humanity and governed with extraordinary knowledge. The Egyptians, with no textual dependence on Sumerian sources, recorded the same thing. 2 of the oldest civilizations on Earth, 2 separate writing traditions, 2 distinct cosmological frameworks, both preserving detailed chronological accounts of a pre-human era of governance that lasted tens of thousands of years. The question isn't whether these records exist. They do. They sit in museums. They've been translated, photographed, debated by scholars for over a century. The question, the quiet one that's been growing since the beginning of this journey, is what you do with them. And as you sit with that question, letting it settle somewhere behind your thoughts, something else begins to surface in the record. Because if the Sumerians and the Egyptians both documented a catastrophic transition point at a moment when the old order ended and something new began, then perhaps the most important question isn't who governed before. Perhaps it's what happened in between. And what happened in between was a flood. Not a metaphorical flood, not a symbolic cleansing narrative. A flood so vast, so total, so deeply embedded in human memory that it appears in the records of virtually every ancient civilization on Earth. And the evidence for it begins exactly where you'd expect back in Mesopotamia, buried beneath 8 feet of river clay. You've heard of the flood before. Everyone has. It's one of those stories that seems to exist everywhere, in every culture, in every tradition, in every corner of the ancient world. But most people think of it as one story, one event, one narrative passed down through religious tradition. The reality is far more layered than that, because the flood doesn't appear in one ancient text. It appears in dozens. And the oldest versions, the ones that predate the biblical account by 1,000 years or more, come from exactly the same region you've been exploring all along, Mesopotamia. The Sumerian king list, that same document you encountered near the beginning of this journey, it contains a single devastating line, a line that divides all of history into 2 eras. It reads, "Then the flood swept over." That's it. 5 words. No elaboration, no dramatic description, just a flat, matter-of-fact statement that separates everything that came before from everything that came after. Before the flood, rains lasting tens of thousands of years. After the flood, rains measured in decades, as though the rules changed, as though whatever system had been in place simply ended. But the Sumerian king list isn't the only Mesopotamian text that records this event. There are at least 2 major narrative accounts, and they're far more detailed. The first is the Atrahasis epic, written in Akkadian, dating to approximately 1800 BCE. though almost certainly based on older Sumerian sources. Atrahasis tells the story of a great flood sent by the gods to reduce the noise of humanity, which, when you read it carefully, sounds less like a punishment and more like a management decision. The text describes how one figure was warned in advance, how he was instructed to build a vessel, how he was given specific dimensions, specific materials, specific instructions for preserving life through the coming deluge. The second account appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically Tablet 11, where the character Utnapishtim recounts almost the identical story to Gilgamesh himself. The flood, the warning, the vessel, the survival, the aftermath. These aren't vague folk tales. They're detailed, structured narratives with specific characters, specific instructions, and specific consequences. And they were written on clay tablets that still exist. You can see them in the British Museum. You can read the translations. But here's where the story takes a turn from text to earth. In 1929, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley was excavating at the ancient city of Ur, one of the oldest urban centres in southern Mesopotamia. He'd been digging for years, uncovering royal tombs, extraordinary artifacts, evidence of a sophisticated civilization. And then his team hit something unexpected. Beneath the layers of human habitation, beneath the pottery, the tools, the traces of daily life, they found a thick band of clean, sterile clay. No artifacts, no bones, no sign of human presence whatsoever. Just river silt, deposited uniformly, 8 feet deep. Imagine standing at the edge of that excavation trench. The sun is flat and white above southern Iraq. The air carries dust and the faint mineral scent of ancient riverbed. Your team has been digging for weeks, carefully peeling back thousands of years of human occupation, layer by layer, and then nothing. A wall of clean granite, smooth and featureless, stretching in every direction across the dig site. You instruct the workers to keep digging, through the clay, past it, and on the other side, beneath 8 feet of sterile flood, deposit the artifacts resume. Different style, older, but unmistakably human. A civilization, then nothing, then a civilization again, separated by a layer of evidence that something enormous had come through and erased everything in between. Woolley sent a telegram to his colleagues. 2 words. We found the flood. Now, was this the flood described in the Sumerian king list? Was it the same event recounted in Atrahasis and Gilgamesh? Scholars have debated that for nearly a century. The dating is complicated. The geography is specific. Some researchers believe Woolley's flood layer represents a severe but localized river event. Others argue it aligns with a much broader catastrophe. But what's beyond dispute is this. The Mesopotamians recorded a civilization-ending flood in their most important historical and literary documents. And at the site of one of their most ancient cities, an archaeologist found physical evidence of a massive inundation separating 2 distinct periods of human habitation, text and earth, story and sediment, saying the same thing. And the Mesopotamians weren't the only ones who remembered. Because when you widen the lens, when you look beyond the Tigris and Euphrates, beyond Mesopotamia, beyond the ancient Near East entirely, you find the same story waiting on every continent, in every major cultural tradition. Over 200 separate flood accounts, scattered across civilizations that had no known contact with one another. 200. Let that number breathe for a moment. 200 distinct cultural traditions from South America to Southeast Asia, from sub-Saharan Africa to the frozen north of Scandinavia, all preserving some version of a catastrophic flood that reshaped the world. Not loosely similar stories, structurally parallel accounts, with shared elements that appear again and again, across oceans and millennia, in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. And the shared elements are remarkably specific. A warning given to one individual or family, a vessel constructed to survive the rising waters, the preservation of knowledge or seeds or animals aboard that vessel. The flood itself, described as total, and then an emergence, a new beginning, a world that looks different afterward. These aren't vague resemblances. These are structural parallels that repeat with a consistency that's very difficult to attribute to coincidence alone. Let's move through a few of them. Slowly. the way this journey has been moving from the start. In the Hindu tradition, there's the story of Manu, the first man who is warned by a great fish about an approaching flood that will consume everything. The fish instructs Manu to build a boat, to gather seeds, to preserve the essentials of civilization. The flood comes. Manu survives. Humanity begins again through his lineage. In the Greek tradition, there's Deucalion, son of Prometheus, who is similarly warned by the gods of an impending deluge. He and his wife Pyrrha build a chest. They survive the flood that covers the world. They repopulate the earth by casting stones behind them, which transform into people. In ancient Chinese tradition, there are multiple flood narratives, including those of Gun and Yu, who struggled for generations to control catastrophic waters that had consumed the known world, and the goddess Nuwa, who repaired the broken sky after a great cosmic catastrophe that brought devastating floods. Among the Maya, the Popol Vuh describes a great flood sent to reshape an earlier version of humanity that the creators considered flawed. Among the Hopi of North America, the flood narrative marks the transition between the third world and the fourth world, a cleansing that separated one era of existence from the next. In Australia, Aboriginal oral traditions, which represent some of the oldest continuous storytelling traditions on Earth, potentially stretching back tens of thousands of years, include accounts of rising seas that swallowed coastlines and transformed the landscape permanently. In West Africa, in Polynesia, in the oral histories of indigenous peoples across South America, the same core narrative emerges: a great flood, a survival, a fresh beginning, now. You could argue that flooding is simply a common natural disaster. Rivers overflow, coastlines shift, tsunamis strike, and so every culture, at some point, would naturally develop a flood story based on local experience. That's a reasonable argument, and for some of these accounts, it may be the complete explanation, but it doesn't explain the structural consistency, because it's not just a flood happened here once, it's the same narrative architecture, the warning, the vessel, the preservation, the emergence appearing in cultures that had no communication with one another. Cultures on opposite sides of the planet, separated by oceans that wouldn't be crossed for millennia. An anthropologist named James George Fraser documented over 100 of these accounts in the early 20th century. More recent surveys have pushed the total past 200. And when researchers have analysed the shared structural elements, statistically comparing narrative motifs across unrelated traditions, the degree of overlap goes well beyond what diffusion theory or shared experience can easily account for. Something happened. Something that was big enough, widespread enough, and traumatic enough to leave an imprint on the collective memory of virtually every civilization that would eventually emerge. And after it happened, something else followed, something quieter, but in many ways more remarkable. Because the flood isn't just a story of ending, it's a story of what was carried through. Because embedded in nearly every one of these flood traditions is a second, quieter narrative, one that doesn't get as much attention. It's not about the waters themselves, it's about what was preserved, the knowledge, the instructions, the things that allowed civilization to start again not from scratch, but from a template, and that template had very specific origins. After the waters receded, something remarkable happened. Civilization didn't start over from nothing. It didn't begin with small groups of survivors, slowly rediscovering fire, reinventing agriculture, stumbling toward language over thousands of painstaking years. Instead, according to the ancient records themselves, knowledge reappeared, quickly, deliberately, as though it had been carried through the catastrophe on purpose. And in every tradition that describes this post-flood emergence, the knowledge arrives through the same kind of figure. A teacher, a sage, a being of extraordinary wisdom who appears after the flood and brings with them the foundational elements of civilization writing, astronomy, mathematics, architecture, agriculture, law. In Sumer, these figures were called the Apkallu, the seven sages. You've already encountered them. They were the advisors to the antediluvian kings, the ones who carried the me, those divine instructions that encoded the operating system of civilization itself. And according to the Mesopotamian tradition, the Apkallu didn't vanish in the flood. Their knowledge was preserved, hidden, entrusted to specific lineages who would carry it forward. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, described how, before the flood, the sage Oannes instructed humanity to bury essential texts in the city of Sippar, so that after the waters receded, the knowledge could be recovered, excavated, redistributed, not reinvented, recovered. And this idea of pre-flood knowledge deliberately preserved and delivered after the catastrophe isn't unique to Mesopotamia. In Egypt, the god Thoth was credited with encoding all essential knowledge into sacred texts, sometimes called the Books of Thoth, that survived the Great Destruction and formed the foundation of Egyptian civilization. In the Hindu tradition, the 7 rishis, the Saptarishi, preserved the Vedic knowledge through the flood, carrying it into the New Age intact. In Mesoamerican traditions, figures like Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha appeared after periods of cosmic upheaval, bringing agriculture, calendrical systems, architectural knowledge, and moral codes to emerging civilizations. 7 sages in Sumer, 7 sages in India, wisdom bearers in Egypt, knowledge bringers across the Americas. The pattern is consistent enough to raise a question that the ancient world seemed to take for granted, but that modern scholarship has been slower to engage with. What if the sudden emergence of complex civilization in multiple locations around the world wasn't spontaneous at all? What if it was delivered, not by aliens, not by some dramatic science fiction mechanism, but by a deliberate transmission system, knowledge preserved through catastrophe and redistributed by figures whose role was precisely that, to carry the template forward? And if that sounds like a stretch, consider the timeline. Between roughly 10,000 and 4,000 BCE, complex civilizations appeared in at least 5 separate locations on Earth: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, and Mesoamerica. Each developed writing, agriculture, mathematics, monumental architecture, and organized religion within a historically narrow window. Each attributed its foundational knowledge not to gradual local development, but to beings or teachers who arrived from elsewhere, from the sea, from the sky, from before the flood. The conventional explanation is independent invention, parallel evolution of ideas, and that's possible. But the ancient texts tell a different story. They describe a system, a network, a deliberate effort to ensure that what was known before the catastrophe would not be lost after it. And right now, as you rest with this, as the weight of continents and millennia settles gently around you, like something warm and familiar, it's worth pausing. Not to answer the question, not yet, but simply to notice where this journey has brought you. You started in a quiet room. You travelled to Sumer. You descended into underground chambers. You climbed a mountain where beings were said to have arrived from somewhere above. You crossed into Egypt and found independent records confirming the same timeline. You witnessed a flood that appears in every corner of human memory. And now, you've arrived at the moment after. The rebuilding. The quiet redistribution of something precious. Let that settle. There's no rush. The next part of this journey will be here when you're ready, because there's one more piece of physical evidence waiting, and it's been waiting for you since Section 5. Remember the Ziggurat? The structure at Uruk that you glimpsed earlier, the Anu Ziggurat, with its strange acoustic properties and chambers that didn't seem designed for ordinary worship? You're going back. And this time, you're going inside. You first encountered the Anu Ziggurat back when we were mapping the Anunnaki Hierarchy, and at the time, I mentioned something that probably stuck with you German acoustic engineers who tested the internal chambers and discovered they resonated at specific frequencies. Frequencies matching the human voice range. But I didn't tell you everything, because the acoustic properties of the Anu Ziggurat aren't unique. They're part of a pattern that appears across ancient sacred architecture and beyond. Let's start with what the engineers actually found. In the late 20th century, a team of researchers conducted systematic acoustic measurements inside the surviving chambers of the Anu Ziggurat at Uruk. They used calibrated microphones and frequency generators, modern technology inside 5,000-year-old walls, and the results were remarkable. The chambers produced standing waves resonance patterns at frequencies between 95 and 120 Hz. That's the range of a deep male voice, a baritone. And the resonance wasn't accidental. The chamber dimensions, the wall thickness, the ceiling height, every measurement contributed to creating this specific acoustic effect. But here's what makes this extraordinary. The same frequency range, 95 to 120 Hz, has been measured in other ancient structures around the world. The Hypogeum of Viel Saflieni in Malta, an underground temple complex carved from solid rock around 3600 BC. Newgrange in Ireland, a passage tomb dating to approximately 3200 BC. The King's Chamber inside the Great Pyramid at Giza. Different civilizations, different continents, different millennia, the same resonant frequency. Now imagine this. Imagine descending a narrow passage. The walls close around you, smooth, dressed stone, cool against your shoulders when you brush against them. The air changes with each step down, cooler, heavier. The sounds of the outside world wind across the Iraqi plain. Distant birds, the hum of the modern world, all of it fades. And then, silence. Not empty silence, occupied silence. The kind of silence that has texture, weight. The kind that presses gently against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own breathing. The chamber opens around you. It's smaller than you expected, perhaps 4 meters across. The ceiling curves above you, smooth limestone, undecorated, precisely shaped. The air smells of mineral dust and deep stone, a smell that's been trapped here for 50 centuries. Cool, clean, ancient. And then you do something the engineers did. You hum, just a low, steady note, nothing dramatic, just your voice offered into the darkness. And the chamber hums back. The stone itself seems to vibrate, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Your voice enters the chamber, and the chamber returns it amplified, enriched, resonating through the walls and the floor and the ceiling, until the boundary between your body and the stone dissolves. You can feel it in your chest, in your ribs, in your jaw, a vibration that doesn't feel external. It feels like the room is breathing with you. The implications of this acoustic engineering are still being debated. Some researchers suggest these chambers functioned as meditation spaces, that the resonant frequencies were designed to induce altered states of consciousness. The 100 Hz range has been shown in modern neuroscience studies to stimulate specific brainwave patterns associated with deep focus and meditative states. Others suggest a more practical function: communication. In an era before electronic amplification, a chamber that could take a human voice and project it with clarity and power would have been an extraordinary tool. Imagine a priest or administrator speaking inside this chamber, their words carried by the resonance to an assembly gathered above. And then there's a third possibility, one that the Sumerian texts themselves seem to support. The cuneiform records describe ziggurats not as temples in the conventional sense, but as a bond between heaven and earth. The word ziggurat itself comes from the Akkadian zagaru, to build high, to raise up, and the texts describe rituals performed inside these structures that involve sustained vocalization, chanting, toning, specific sound sequences directed at the upper chambers, as if the building itself was an instrument, not for music, not for prayer in the way we understand it, but for something else, something that required specific frequencies, specific acoustics, specific architectural precision that we're only beginning to understand. And here's what connects this back to everything you've encountered tonight. The same civilization that produced the Apkallu traditions, the 7 sages who brought specific technical knowledge, the same civilization that recorded the Anunnaki Hierarchy with its territorial divisions and administrative structures, the same civilization that described objects that shone and spoke and required activation protocols. That same civilization built structures engineered to precise acoustic specifications that modern technology has only recently been able to measure and verify. The pattern keeps deepening. Every layer you excavate reveals another layer beneath it. Evidence supporting evidence. Text confirming archaeology. Acoustics confirming architecture. And all of it pointing toward a level of sophistication that the standard timeline of human development struggles to accommodate. The ziggurat chambers don't prove anything on their own, but they add another frequency to the chord, another data point in a pattern that stretches from Eridu to Giza, from cuneiform to the Book of Enoch, from underground water chambers to mountain peaks. And there's still more. Because the knowledge embedded in these structures, the mathematics, the astronomy, the acoustic engineering, didn't disappear when the flood receded and the first post-flood civilizations emerged. It traveled, it evolved, and it surfaced in places you might not expect. Because scattered across the ancient world in star charts and temple alignments and mathematical constants that appear in civilizations separated by oceans, there's a thread of shared astronomical knowledge. And following that thread leads somewhere extraordinary. The civilizations we've been tracing tonight, Sumerian, Egyptian, the builders at Baalbek, they shared something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough. They all knew the precession of the equinoxes. If that term is new to you, precession is a very slow wobble in Earth's axis, like a spinning top beginning to slow down. Our planet traces a circle in the sky. Over the course of roughly 25,920 years, the North Pole doesn't always point at Polaris. It sweeps through different stars in a cycle so vast that no single human lifetime could observe it. No 10 human lifetimes could observe it from start to finish. And yet, the Sumerians encoded it. The Egyptians aligned their monuments to it. Hindu astronomers calculated it. The Maya tracked it. Cultures separated by oceans and millennia, working with the same number. 25,920 years. Modern astronomers using satellites and computers calculate the actual figure at 25,772 years. The ancient figure is within 0.5%, but the precision isn't even the strangest part. The strangest part is what that precision requires. To measure precession, you need continuous astronomical observation over at least 2,000 years. You need systems of record-keeping that survive across generations. You need mathematics sophisticated enough to extrapolate a 26,000-year cycle from a 2,000-year dataset. And you need institutional memory, organizations, traditions, lineages of trained observers that can outlast droughts, wars, famines, and the rise and fall of kingdoms. You need, in short, a civilization, not a collection of scattered tribes, not hunter-gatherers who happen to look up at the stars, a civilization with continuity, resources, and purpose. Picture this for a moment. You're standing on the uppermost platform of the Great Ziggurat at Ur. It's roughly 2100 BC. The air is warm and still, carrying faint traces of burnt offerings from the temple level below. Above you, the sky is enormous, no light pollution, no haze, just an ocean of stars so dense it almost has texture. A priest astronomer kneels beside a stone sighting wall. He's carefully marking the position of a star against a notch carved by his predecessor's predecessor. The records he's consulting are already ancient. The earliest tablets are crumbling at the edges. He is not discovering anything new tonight. He is confirming something that was already old when the first brick of this ziggurat was laid. This is the pattern that keeps emerging. Not independent discovery, but institutional preservation of knowledge that was already ancient when the first ziggurats were built. And it goes beyond astronomy. The ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, what we call pi, is encoded in the Great Pyramid, base perimeter divided by twice its height, accurate to 4 decimal places, 3.1415, in a structure built around 2560 BC. The square root of 2 appears on a Mesopotamian clay tablet known as YBC 7289, dated to approximately 1800 BC, calculated to an accuracy of times 6 decimal places. That level of precision wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance, more than 3,000 years later. And then there's the number times 72. It takes 72 years for the precessional cycle to shift exactly 1 degree against the background stars. The Egyptian myth of Osiris involves exactly 72 conspirators. Hindu sacred tradition identifies 72 as a cosmic number. Chinese tradition speaks of 72 sacred peaks. The Kabbalistic tradition names 72 names of God. 72 appears in Norse mythology, in Aztec cosmology, in the ancient Persian Bundahish. 1 or 2 of these could be coincidence, all of them appearing across civilizations on opposite sides of the planet, all tied to the same astronomical constant times that is not coincidence. That is curriculum. Something was being transmitted, a body of knowledge astronomical, mathematical, architectural, carried from culture to culture, teacher to student across thousands of years, not through genetics, not through casual trade, through deliberate, structured instruction. The question isn't whether this transmission happened. The evidence is too consistent, too precise, too geographically widespread for chance. The question is, who started the teaching, and when? The Sumerians provided an answer. They called them the Apkallu 7 sages, sent after the Great Flood to re-establish civilization. Fish-cloaked figures depicted on cylinder seals, arriving from the sea carrying tablets of knowledge. Every culture we've examined tonight has its own version of this same story. Teachers who appeared after a catastrophe, bearers of knowledge from before the waters rose. For most of recorded history, these accounts were dismissed as origin myths. But modern archaeology is making that dismissal increasingly difficult to sustain, because the further back we look, the more sophisticated the evidence becomes, and nowhere is this more apparent than in Egypt. Egyptian civilization didn't emerge gradually the way conventional timelines suggest. The earliest dynasties appear with a fully formed hieroglyphic writing system, advanced mathematics, architectural techniques that were never surpassed in 3,000 subsequent years of Egyptian history, and a priestly tradition that claimed with absolute institutional conviction that their knowledge came from somewhere else, from someone older. The Turin Royal Canon, a papyrus dating to the reign of Ramesses II, around 1250 BC, is one of the most important documents in Egyptology. It lists every ruler of Egypt in chronological order. But it doesn't begin with Menes, the first human pharaoh. It begins with a sequence of divine and semi-divine rulers stretching back times 36,620 years times before the first dynasty. Conventional Egyptology treats this as mythology, a creation narrative dressed in royal clothing. But that number, 36,620, is not random. It is exactly 1.5 precessional cycles, an oddly precise figure for a myth. The priests at the Temple of Horus at Edfu maintained a collection known as the building texts. These describe, in remarkable architectural detail, how the original sacred mounds, the first temples, were destroyed by a great flood, how the primeval waters consumed everything, and how the survivors, called the Sheptu, meaning the ancestors, sailed to new lands to rebuild what had been lost. These weren't casual folk tales. They were institutional records, maintained by a priestly class whose entire organizational purpose was the preservation of knowledge across generations. Priests who underwent decades of training, whose traditions were passed from teacher to student with the kind of rigor we might associate with surgical residencies or military command structures. And the knowledge they preserved was extraordinary. The mystery school tradition, the formalized transmission of sacred knowledge from master to initiate, is often credited to ancient Greece. But the Greeks themselves told us exactly where they learnt it. Thales of Miletus, the man Western philosophy credits as its first practitioner, studied in Egypt. Not a brief visit. He studied under Egyptian priests who had been maintaining their knowledge systems for over 2,000 years before Thales ever arrived. Pythagoras spent 22 years in Egyptian temples. 22 years. When he returned to Greece, he established a school. It taught what we now call the Pythagorean theorem, the relationship between the sides of a right triangle. The Egyptians had been using this relationship for centuries. It's embedded in the proportions of the Great Pyramid. Pythagoras didn't discover it. He translated it. Plato studied at Heliopolis, the Egyptian city of the sun, one of the oldest centers of learning in the ancient world. And it was from Egyptian priests that Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, heard the story of Atlantis. The priests told Solon, with what ancient sources describe as gentle condescension, that the Greeks were like children, that Greek civilization was young, that Egypt was old, and that those who came before Egypt were older still. The chain of transmission is traceable. Pre-flood civilization, whatever it was, passed knowledge to the Sumerian Apkallu. The Apkallu traditions fed into the Egyptian priestly schools. Apkallu, the Egyptian schools taught the Greek philosophers. Greek philosophy became the foundation of Western thought. We are, all of us, downstream of a river whose source we cannot see. And the mechanism of this transmission was not accidental. It was engineered. The mystery schools operated on a principle that would be immediately familiar to anyone working in modern information security: redundancy through distributed storage. Knowledge was divided into hierarchical levels. Each level required years, sometimes decades, of demonstrated mastery before the next was revealed. Multiple schools in different geographic locations held overlapping but not identical portions of the total knowledge base. Heliopolis held certain teachings. Memphis held others. Thebes held still more. If one location was destroyed by invasion, by earthquake, by political upheaval, the knowledge survived elsewhere. This was the ancient world's version of a distributed backup system, and it worked. Through the collapse of the Old Kingdom, through the Hyksos invasion, through the Bronze Age catastrophe around 1200 BC, a collapse so total it destroyed every other major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Egyptian priestly tradition survived intact for over 3,000 years. But even these meticulous custodians acknowledged they were preservers, not creators. The knowledge they held was older than Egypt itself, and this is where template degradation becomes visible. When you compare the earliest Egyptian construction with later work, the quality doesn't improve over time. It decreases. The internal passages of the Great Pyramid, built around 2560 BC, were cut with joints fitted to within times 1/50th of an inch. Later pyramids, built with supposedly more experience, never matched this precision. This pattern repeats across the ancient world. The earliest Sumerian Ziggurat foundations show higher precision than later reconstructions on the same sites. The oldest megalithic walls at Sacsayhuaman in Peru are more precisely fitted than later additions built directly on top of them. Everywhere, the oldest work is the best work. This is not what you expect from a civilization learning and improving. This is what you expect from a civilization copying with decreasing fidelity from an original that no longer exists. Like a photocopy of a photocopy. Each generation losing a little more resolution. Someone designed a system of knowledge transmission so effective that it outlasted every empire, every dark age, every catastrophe the ancient world could produce. That is not mythology. That is engineering. And then, in 1994, a Kurdish shepherd stumbled across carved stones protruding from a hillside in southeastern Turkey. He thought they might be old gravestones. They were the capstones of something that would force archaeology to reconsider its most fundamental assumptions. What archaeologist Klaus Schmidt uncovered at Göbekli Tepe is, by any measure, one of the most significant archaeological finds of the modern era. 12,000 years old, 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid, 5,000 years older than writing itself. Built at the end of the last ice age, when human beings were supposedly simple hunter-gatherers incapable of organized construction, massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing over 20 tons, arranged in precise concentric circles, carved with sophisticated animal reliefs and symbols that researchers have tentatively identified as astronomical markers, aligning with known star positions from that era. Göbekli Tepe wasn't a settlement. No houses, no water source, no evidence of permanent habitation. It was built exclusively as a ceremonial site by people who hadn't yet developed agriculture, or rather by people who developed agriculture times specifically to support this site. Genetic analysis has shown that the earliest domesticated wheat strains originated within 60 miles of Göbekli Tepe. The conventional narrative says, first farming, then settlement, then religion, then monuments. Göbekli Tepe reverses the entire sequence. First the knowledge, first the monument, then everything else followed. And around 8000 BC, the entire complex was deliberately buried, not destroyed, carefully, intentionally filled with soil, as if someone wanted to preserve it until it was needed again. Genetic studies add another layer. Ancient DNA analysis has revealed significant population bottlenecks, sharp crashes in human numbers at precisely the periods these flood narratives describe. Around 12,000 years ago, during the Younger Dryas, sea levels rose by as much as times 400 feet. Coastlines where civilizations would logically have developed are now submerged. We are searching for evidence of a lost civilization in places we cannot yet reach. And so we're left with questions that can no longer be responsibly ignored. Who built Göbekli Tepe? Why does every ancient culture tell the same story of knowledge-bearing teachers arriving after a flood? How did astronomical constants travel between civilizations separated by oceans? Why does ancient construction quality decrease over time rather than increase? We don't have definitive answers. Anyone who tells you they do is selling something. What we have is a pattern, knowledge that appears fully formed, that degrades rather than improves, that every ancient source attributes to teachers from before a catastrophe, and that modern archaeology, genetics, and geology are now confirming piece by careful piece. The mystery isn't solved, but it is no longer possible to pretend it doesn't exist. And perhaps that's enough for tonight, because what we've really been talking about beneath the ziggurats, the king lists, the astronomical calculations, and the buried temples is something very simple. The human refusal to let knowledge die. Think about what it meant to be alive after a catastrophe that destroyed everything familiar. The places you knew submerged, the systems that organized your life gone. And in that aftermath, someone made a choice, not merely to survive, survival is instinct, but to teach, to take what they knew and make certain it wasn't lost, to carve the most important truths in stone, because they had learned the hardest way imaginable that nothing else endures. And 12,000 years later, a shepherd stumbles over a carved stone on a hillside, and the whole story begins to surface again. There is a thread that runs from those first post-flood teachers to the Sumerian scribes who pressed cuneiform into wet clay, from the scribes to the Egyptian priests who maintained their records for 3 millennia, from the priests to the Greek philosophers who carried fragments westward, from the philosophers to the archaeologists and geneticists who are now slowly, carefully pulling the thread to see where it leads. You are part of that thread. Every time you wonder about the past, every time you look at the stars and feel something ancient stir, you are participating in the oldest human tradition, older than writing, older than agriculture, older than the ziggurats. It is the thread that connects us, all of us, across 12,000 years of flood and forgetting, and it hasn't broken yet. Tonight, that thread feels close as the warmth of wherever you're resting right now. Wherever you are tonight, whether it's early morning or the deep middle of the night, you've just spent the last few hours doing exactly what those ancient teachers hoped someone would do. You listened, you wondered, you followed the thread a little further. That's enough. That's more than enough. Rest well. Good night.